Hi, it's Ron Turpin, your host of PODigal Sons, a new podcast in which we talk about a wide range of Christian topics as well as topics that affect humanity in general. And we also are covering the Bible all the way from Genesis to Revelation. Today is our first installment of the Bible Companion series, and we are beginning with Genesis chapters 1 through 5. I would invite you to read those chapters before the podcast, and it'll be a lot more comprehensive learning. So I'm going to begin today. First off, just want to thank everybody for all the support on the podcast. I want to thank the commenters. We do have a lot of engagement, especially from people in the atheist community. I will go ahead and say that we are definitely going to be exploring that further. I love to see engagement, especially if people are having questions about faith in general. We want to be a podcast that is welcoming of those questions, and we want to talk to you. So if you are interested in doing a future podcast episode with me, whether that is going to be on the Bible Companion series, or if you want to have a good spirited debate, I don't mind doing that at all. So you can shoot me an email at podigalson777@gmail.com, or you can drop a comment and we will correspond. So I want to go ahead, before we get into Genesis 1 through 5, I did want to talk a little bit about how is the Bible collected. So when we refer to the Old Testament, really we're referring to the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh as it's called, and there's a sort of a process into how this gets installed into our canon, and it really happened around 300 AD. The church fathers got together, and they started collecting the parts of the Hebrew Bible, as well as letters that had been written, copies of these letters, manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, and they formed the New Testament and the Old Testament and combined them into what we call the Bible. The oldest copy of the Old Testament, which is what we're talking about, the Tanakh, is the Ketaf Inam silver scroll amulets, which were discovered in 1979. They have parts of Deuteronomy, and it's kind of a fragmented part of it, but it does match up to what has been in the Bible for forever. It dates back to actually before the destruction of the temple, so it was probably around 600 or 700 BC or something like that. So there is a historical method, and I want to talk about this. This podcast is not going to be something where we sort of hop around the tough subjects. We're going to talk about everything, especially the tough things. That's what this podcast is actually for. But when we apply the historical method to the Bible, there's a lot of manuscripts for the New Testament, an almost overwhelming amount. But the Old Testament, and there's a lot of verification with the life of Christ, from secular sources, from outside of the Bible. But for the Old Testament, it's a lot different. There is a lot of back and forth between who wrote that, or who wrote the Torah, the Pentateuch as it's called, which is really just Greek for 5 books. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So how this is applied, or how applying the historical method to the Old Testament, there's a bit of a gap, and especially when you talk about the life of Moses. Looking at it, and there's a lot of different ways that you could go with that as far as who wrote the Tanakh. For me, I still would say Moses, and plus some collective authors. It is a sacred text. The law of Moses is the word of God. You could get into the priestly stories and the Jawas stories and the Elohist. You could go down that road, and that's just, to me, honestly, it turns into this goose chase of who wrote what. And I sort of have this override by the Creator that I will always refer to as the Creator override, so to speak, which we'll talk about that in a second. But when you talk about Moses, the author, it is my understanding that Moses wrote the Tanakh, and it is my belief that he did. He might have had Ezra or somebody like that came in, and maybe there were some stories that were passed down orally that eventually got added back into the Tanakh. But it's my belief that Moses definitely wrote the Tanakh. And the oldest, or probably the most recent discovery and one of the oldest copies of a full manuscript is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we talked about on the last podcast. But Moses, it's hard to prove, Moses really from an archaeological standpoint. There's really nothing out there that points directly to Moses. I would say, though, that there are going to be some things we'll talk about that are pretty clear indications that he definitely did the things that he is claiming to have done. And we'll talk about that. But as far as the archaeological record, there does seem to be this sort of gap. But a lot of people I think they have this preconceived notion that the Israelites were this put together group of people that that had everything squared away, and they had a hard enough time keeping up with their own relics. You read about how the Ark of the Covenant got sort of just lost, even when they had it in their possession at the time. They had their own Torah, their own copy that they just somehow found one day, like they hadn't even kept up with it. So for me, 3,500 years ago, for a group of people that were wanderers, that were constantly embedding themselves into other nations, that were actually instructed to not build a temple for a very long time, I wouldn't be surprised at all that they wouldn't find anything. You would have to go and tear out, almost all of the desert around Mount Sinai to try to find something. And they very well could easily find something one day. But I sort of have this faith in the Creator that what I'm reading is what I'm supposed to be reading. So I don't play these metaphorical games with Exodus. It happens the way it says it happens. And it's something that we'll definitely maybe go into on a different podcast, the archaeological life or the archaeological record of Moses, and how that might work in. I will say that there is a lot of discoveries, though. You can go look at the Averis statue, which seems to be a statue of Joseph, which actually would predate Moses. And then you have the Merneptah stele, which definitely is 100% verification of the time of Judges. We'll pull that up and show you, but this was a secular source that is confirming that the Israelites did not have a king at the time, which is exactly what the Bible says. So there's a lot of proof in that. There's the Hittite Empire, which for a long time, archaeologists and a lot of people doubted their existence. They were only known to have existed in the Bible, is kind of how the story goes on that. And then they find this big discovery and they confirm the existence of the Hittites. And then you kind of just have to look at the big picture stuff, right? I mean, you have the split rock at Horeb, which, I mean, you just look at the thing and it just looks like Moses struck this. And also, there's water coming out of it. People don't understand why there would look like there would have been water coming out of this thing. Mount Sinai is scorched at the top. Nobody really knows why. but other than what it says in the Bible and that there was a fire there. And there is an altar at the base of Mount Sinai, or what appears to be an altar, and then what looks like 12 pillars. So I'm not surprised at all that it's hard to prove Moses. This was 3,500 years ago, and he is going to be the first person that recorded Genesis. And I'm talking about this because I want to talk about the origin of the Tanakh. You also just kind of have to look at the Jewish people, right? I mean, they are a unique bunch of people that have grit and determination about themselves. Even in our past 100 years, I mean, they went from going through a Holocaust to setting up their own city-state. So even in the past 100 years, I mean, these people have gone through a lot. And so to say that they don't have any basis in their history, I mean, to say that Moses didn't do that, you're almost saying that, the Jewish people don't exist, which is just not true. So something we'll do maybe a longer podcast on, but I just want to hit on a couple of those. We are constantly finding new discoveries every day. There was the recent discovery of the mosaic that was just found. So at some point, there's going to be things that get found. But God ultimately is in control of everything, and he could definitely control what he wants us to read. So, I'm not going to go so far into those different ways that people kind of see how the Bible was written. It's something worth talking about, but ultimately, I have faith in the Creator, and I know that what I'm reading is what he wants me to read. And we should hold this word sacred. There's going to be different books that don't get put into the Protestant Bible, the Apocrypha, and there's things that I appreciate how scrutinized it is, because it's not just like everything gets put into the Bible. There is a process there, and we'll talk about that process on a different podcast maybe at some point, or just like I've been saying, like we'll maybe just do one podcast on it. But I appreciate the Catholic fathers of their church for putting together the Bible. I appreciate the scrutiny by which Protestants look at how some of the books came into place, and I think all of us together have done as good of a job as possible. And ultimately, who really wrote the Bible is the Holy Spirit, and that's what's guiding these church fathers in around 300 AD to put this thing together. So we know it came from God, and we don't really need anything else. We can go do all the archaeological stuff that we want, but ultimately it doesn't really truly matter. I just find that side of it interesting, and I do like to include the skeptics into this conversation. So we will be, having those conversations. But for the most part, that's gonna sort of die down on this Bible Companion podcast. At some point, the Word is going to take over, and we're not really going to be talking about some of this archaeological stuff. But for me, it's Moses that wrote it. Like I said, there probably were some oral, passed down stories things that got put in at some point. You have the first story of creation, which kind of sounds like a ordered, more uniform description of how this went down. And then you have the second story, which is more intimate and maybe something that was, passed down in a different way. We're not going to get also so bogged down into the Hebrew of things. The Tanakh is a Hebrew Bible. There's also Greek manuscripts of it. Pentateuch is Greek for 5 books. I think I might have already said that. But either way, guys, I'm not going to stop every single second and talk about the Greek. If it's appropriate, we'll bring it up. But we really want to talk about the content of what the Bible is trying to say to us. We're going to start in, this starts around 4000 BC, 4004 BC. We're going to do this chronologically. I know that there's approaches to the Bible, doing Bible studies, and people will sort of hop around, or they tell you to read the New Testament first. My brain just, I don't work that way. And I'm very much from start to finish, I want to know the whole story. I want to know everything. And that's why we're doing it this way, because we do want to know everything. And you can't really understand the New Testament, I don't think so, without understanding the Old Testament. If I was to tell somebody in the first 5 minutes of meeting them or try to explain God, I would definitely have to talk about the New Testament. But now that we have all this time, I want to do it right, and I want to talk about the entire Bible. So we're going to do 5 chapters. Normally 5 chapters is not going to take that. We'll probably do more like 10 chapters in one podcast. But because we're doing the beginning of Genesis, we're going to, this is going to take some time. So we're just doing 5 chapters for now. And let's get started. So in the beginning, we have the heavens and the earth. We talked about that on the last podcast. We don't really know how long this time period was in which the heavens and the earth were created. We have no reason to believe a certain time was associated for these events or for this creation. It very well could have been one day, but it doesn't say. For me, it is, I would say billions of years, because that's really all we have on that information. So we have the earth, and we have the heavens, and we have a formless wasteland, is as it's, the earth is formless, and there's darkness that's covering the abyss, and a wind, or the Spirit of God, is hovering over the waters. There's some say wind. I think it's the Spirit, because wherever God is, there's a Spirit. So we're going to go with Spirit. But either way, that's all we have in the beginning. And then day 1 is light. And we have light now. This is not the sun. This is God's light. There are many instances which we could look at that are going to talk about God using light or blocking out the sun for the Egyptians, but also using light at the same time in the same place, having light on the Israelites. There's no way for that to happen if God can't create light himself. So right now we're just talking about God's light. And then you have an expanse, which is day 2. This is an interesting thing that happens. Basically, there's water, on the earth, and then now water gets put in the atmosphere, an additional amount of water than what we see. And it actually explains why humans might have lived as long as they did in the beginning, because with more water in the atmosphere, it's just more conducive to light. I don't want to go down the science of that. We'd save that for another day, but it's just interesting. The 3rd day, God creates land and every kind of plant and seed. At some point, we talked about the pre-sin death thing, which is always weird for me. But I would imagine that these plants operated like any other plant, and you have some sort of fruit that falls and decays, and another, we don't really know a whole lot about how this worked in the beginning. All we can kind of go off of is what we're given. But anyway, we have land, and for the 4th day, God does something really cool, and he brings in the sun and the moon. Like I mentioned, the sun could have already existed in the part of the billions of years, and he could have brought it to the earth. However else you want to think about that, like I mentioned in the last podcast, you sort of have to think outside the box, because God could have done anything to create this. The moon is actually a very interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people talk about. This is more evidence of a designer and a creator. Without the moon, we couldn't have life on this planet. I think we'd be in some sort of ice age. But it serves a great purpose, and you kind of have to wonder, who put that there? Why is that there? We know it's God, but everything has a purpose. The moon is one of them. It could have very well not existed. I don't know why the moon has to exist other than to provide life for us, which, all seems to point to a creator. You have the sun that marks the days and the moon that marks the months. So it all just makes sense. Time. Now we talked about time not working necessarily for in the same way that time might have worked in the, for us as we think about it, right? And this is actually mentioned in Second Peter, chapter 3, verse 8. With the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day. So, 1 second, guys. Sorry. My daughters are kind of being loud. I'm just trying to get them preoccupied. But so we have, time not necessarily working the same, and it's interesting that Peter is pointing this out. Before, at the time, I don't think a lot of people, there probably weren't many people that were prodding things about how old, the earth was or whatever, how old anything was. But it's interesting that that's in there and explains a lot. But we'll go back to that if we need to. Day 5, we have animals. God's like, hey, let's start making some cool stuff. We're going to start putting animals on this thing. Day 5 was sea creatures and birds. You have day 6, land animals now. And this is where he also makes man. Man is given dominion over the cattle and all the creatures that crawl on the ground. That to me just says that we're given dominion over the creatures that crawl on the ground, which would include the snake, I would say. But we're kind of, you'll hear people talking about Satan or the devil, and if we are under his rule right now, and that's who really truly is ruling the world, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's get into this creation of man, because this is really what this whole thing is about, and we have to read it from the lens of God. This is his story, but this is the story of God and his creation of this thing called man. God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So this is different. We're in his image, in his divine image that he created man. Nothing else that he created was in his divine image. So we are special in a way in that regard. We do have to sort of really take that in when we read this, that we are not just some other, creation. I give you plants and animals. It seemed like they definitely ate plants and stuff. We can talk more about that. And I just, the pre-sin death thing to me is weird, especially when you think about dinosaurs and stuff. But if you ever want to go watch the first video, I kind of talk about some of that, and where the dinosaurs might have came from. So I would go check out episode 1 if you still have those questions. But we're going to move on. So his first commandment to us is to be fruitful and multiply. And this is really the first commandment that we are given. And it's something that sort of comes up. So that's chapter 1. The 7th day, it says he rested. There are people that believe that we're still in the 7th day. I don't, maybe we are. I don't really see how that's the case. I don't know, but I would say that we're not. I don't know. You could probably look at that 500 different ways. There's like an old joke. If you get like 10 theologists in a room and ask them to give their perspective, you'd get 20 different perspectives. But anyway, so the 7th day he rested, and that's where we get the Sabbath from. But then we get into chapter 2 is going to talk about the second creation story. And this one seems a little more intimate because we're talking more about man and how man's relationship with this new thing that is created, woman. In these early writers, they knew that this was different in some way. You have like what seems to be plants coming after man. woman coming after man, even though that sort of is different than what the first story of creation. You have to understand these are different styles in which this story is told. In either whatever lens you might be looking at it, it could have happened differently. For the man, I bet it'd be hard for him to really tell what happened and when it happened. And so anything that's passed down from Adam to the next generation, he sort of could have been saying it from his perspective, and that's what eventually gets passed down. But it is there's some differences there. I'm not going to get so far locked up into those differences. Honestly, they're very negligible differences, and we don't really need to kind of focus in on it, But basically, the second story is a lot more intimate about how man was created from the breath of God himself, formed from the clay of the ground. And we go into God planting this garden, which is kind of different than the rest of his creation. You have the garden, which has all these delightful plants that are there that kind of grow without man working it. They just sort of appear. And food, multiplication or food creation is a very common theme that we'll see sort of throughout the Bible with manna and Christ doing this. There's something intimate about like being fed by God, and that's kind of what we are kind of thrown into in the beginning here with the Garden of Eden. And then we're introduced to a very cool concept. So we have the tree of life and we have the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So there's two different trees. One is going to provide life eternally, and the other is going to take it away. And we'll talk about why that tree was created. Let's go ahead and get into that. And this is going to kind of open up other things, why was a snake created and that kind of thing. But for me, why was that tree created? This seems to be like a way that he knew he could trust man. And if the time ever come that we would betray him, he would know. This is sort of, for me, like the tree of free will. He's giving us the option. If we didn't have the option to go live out on our own, then it sort of turns into this weird relationship where, I'm not so sure if it's even, like I've said in the previous, in episode 1, I'm not really sure that's a creation if he's sort of tying us down to him. So by giving us this tree, it's sort of saying, hey, whenever you're ready to leave me, this is your way out. If you're not happy with what I have set up for you, by all means, go eat of this tree, because that'll be it for you. And it's that ability to choose is what makes this creation beautiful. For me, I think without the tree, I think it's an incomplete creation. It's a really good question. Why does the tree exist, right? And it's sort of like, why do we exist? And talking about why does evil exist, and that's really like, why do we have to exist? Why does God need us? And he wants us. He wants to see his creation blossom, and he wants to be a tangible part of this world. And so by giving us a choice, it just makes everything much more beautiful. We're not, slaves in that sense to God. We have this ability to choose, and that's what sort of completes the creation for me. So we're also introduced to the 4 rivers, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Pishon, the Gihon. I don't know if I'm saying those things right, guys, but there's 4 rivers. We can go point them out on a map. But either way. And then you have Havilah and the land of Cush. Havilah is this land of gold, and gold seems to be assigned a certain type of value right now in this passage. But either way, we're kind of getting set up for the world that these people are going to inhabit eventually. The second commandment is the commandment from God that says you can eat from the trees of the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of it, you surely are doomed to die. Remember that, because that's going to come up later. But at this point, we are not supposed to be eating of this tree. So God wants to make a partner for man. He sees that Adam is seemingly alone, and wants to create this partner. So he makes some animals. They don't seem to really do the job, and God makes Eve out. He takes the rib out of Adam and makes Eve. And then Adam is really happy about this, it seems. This one at last is bone of my bone, a bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, and out of her, man, this one has been taken. So we now have a woman in this story. This sets up sort of the foundation for marriage, which is very important. But they were just big chilling in the garden. Didn't really have any worries, They were just kind of hanging out. And then, now that was chapter 2. So let's get in chapter 3. So Lord makes the serpent. He does make the serpent, and this is specified here. Why does God make this serpent? Why does he provide this sort of temptation? And ultimately, I feel like mankind was destined to go live out on its own and sort of not live under the protection of God forever. This isn't necessarily, I'm just giving you my opinion on it, guys. I mean, you could think about this how you want to think about it. But for me, I do feel like at any point, Eve could have stayed away from this thing for millennia, for all we know. But the point of it is that eventually she does sort of succumb to it. And I think God is testing us here. I mean, God really wants to know who we are, and if we are really going to follow him, or, are we just kind of doing it out of comfort? And that is an interesting sort of concept to explore. But there's something that just resonates with me about going and doing it on your own and living on your own, that I feel like just needed to happen. God, in a way, is kind of like, let's see what you got, right? You're my creation. You're going to get tested. I don't really feel like, oh, why did God test us with this terrible thing? It's his world, and he can set the guidelines for whatever he wants to. But for me, I do think it's something that eventually would have happened, regardless. So we're introduced to this thing, the ancient serpent, which is as it's called in Revelation. But the serpent starts with, did God really tell you? This is kind of what we hear in today's world. Like, hey, did God really say this? Is that really in the Bible? Is God, do you guys really believe this? And that's sort of how he starts. And he says, did God really tell you that you cannot eat of this tree? One thing about the talking snake, and this isn't the only talking animal in the Bible, there are other talking animals. So for me, definitely could have been a talking snake. It could have had some sort of, took some other form, after it was a snake. It could have turned into the devil himself. I don't know. We don't really need to know, but for all intents and purposes, this is a talking snake. And it's sort of the cool stuff you get with creationism. You go watch that first episode, but creationism is going to have all these kind of really cool things. You're going to get people with superpowers, seemingly, talking snakes, and just the coolest stuff. So we're sort of starting off with something that's really cool. The serpent says, you will surely not die. And he's twisting how God sort of gave that command. You will not surely die immediately in the sense that we think about it, but you will die in a different sort of way. In the same way that Christ talks about, dying spiritually. And you will be, your sort of status of immortality is going to die. And that's really what God, was saying. But the serpent sort of tricks Eve and is like, you will not surely die. And this is one of the, very first lies that you hear from Satan amongst many others. But this creature is maybe living amongst the tree, just a theory. I don't know. Maybe he was in there like, hey, if you ever come around this thing, like, just know you're going to get tested. The closer you go into the tree, the more you'll get tested. I think that's kind of what God set this thing up to be. A lot of people are going to say the snake is Lucifer, like I just mentioned, the reference to the ancient serpent in Revelation, this powerful angel that rebels from God. It makes sense as far as what he says about the tree, and wanting to become God yourself is sort of an ancient idea, and this worship of self, which you see that in our society, this worship of what's ever best for me. He gets right to the heart of where sin comes from: greed, jealousy, all these different things. It's hinting at this like very primal temptation to worship the self and not worship God, and just do what's best for yourself. And it's like, why doesn't God just destroy Lucifer? Or why doesn't God just destroy the snake? And we've been talking about this, but this is sort of the chapter to talk about this, because it's by his own grace. It's the same reason he just doesn't destroy man entirely. He's not going to basically do what he's telling us to have grace and forgiveness. But he's not just going to kill everything that moves. And ultimately, I mean, it's a tough thing to understand. That's not an easy thing to answer, but he has this purpose, and it's not necessarily for us to completely understand. But for me, I think Lucifer sort of symbolizes the creation of free will, and it's sort of this thing that just has to exist in order to have free will. God creates free will. Free will sort of elects Lucifer, and that's sort of what you have. And God can't destroy free will, because then if he did, we'd sort of be back to square one. If he destroys Lucifer, and then you have free will, and then we make another Lucifer, basically. So it's because of this free will that we're gifted that we sort of create this thing. We ourselves have created this thing. It's not like God necessarily wants this thing to exist. He's just basically, it's part of a creation, in that we have to have the ability to choose. It's kind of like, I don't want to dumb this down entirely, but you have the Batman who sort of refuses to kill Joker, and he's taking this higher stance about himself, and I mean, I could kind of see how that would work. And I kind of, it's a hard thing to talk. We could have a whole podcast on why does God allow serpents, evil serpents, and Lucifer and evil and da da da. But we've talked about it a lot, and eventually we kind of move on, because for me, I have the answer and I understand fully the answer, but it's trying to get you guys, or maybe some other skeptic or somebody, to see that answer is a tough thing to explain. But you just have to understand that we are sort of creating that ourselves when we are given free will. We, we'll read about it, but time and time again, we choose to live outside of the presence of God, and we ourselves create this idolatry, or this worship of this other thing, and the manifestation of that other thing sort of manifests itself into Lucifer. Anyways, it's also interesting that we sort of have this instinctful nature to not like snakes, and that's how it kind of takes the form of that. And so it's just we are sort of thrown into this world now, of being apart from God. Their eyes did indeed open, and they did seem to now possess knowledge of good and evil. They cover themselves. They're naked and afraid, and they were kind of living in this ignorance is bliss sort of society. And God's like, I don't think you guys don't want to know what's out there. You don't want to know about the evil things that can exist. And this, I have this great like umbrella cushy life that I created about, for you. Trust me, you don't want to know about it. And the day that you do want to go find out about it, you're going to find out the hard way. And so that's exactly what happens. God confronts them about this and is like, hey, who told you? 1 second, guys. All right, so we have Adam, and God confronts him about this, and immediately Adam is sort of in this denial mode, as far as taking responsibility. Immediately blames Eve, kind of throws her under the bus. The man replied, the woman whom you put here with me, she gave me fruit from the tree. He's almost blaming, he's blaming God right there. But he's blaming God, which is, that's probably one of the worst things that he says right there. And then, she gave me the fruit from the tree, so I ate it. And then the Lord God asked the woman, why did you do such a thing? And now she puts blame on the serpent. The serpent made me do it. So now we start seeing that God is going to react to this. First, he punishes the snake. He takes away its legs, which is interesting. If you ever go look at snakes, they sort of used to have legs at some point, and now they don't. But anyways, on your belly you shall crawl. I will put enmity between you and the woman. Again, we're not really talking about snakes right now. We're talking about the devil. And so we're going to have this, long-lasting, I guess, feud, you could call it, between mankind and the devil. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. So the devil having offspring, whether that's actual descendants, for me, it very well could be. But the woman having offspring, and that's sort of what we'll kind of more focus on. He will strike at your head while you strike at his heel. And we're talking about the woman's offspring. This is sort of the first prophecy of Christ. And it's interesting that in crucifixion, they have found that it was done through the heel bone. So that's an interesting thing that I just wanted to point out. But this whole concept of the woman's offspring striking the head of this thing, and he might get a little something. That's kind of interesting. It's like, you might damage my heel, but I'm going to walk that off. I'm going to crush your head, your head, not just your heel. So it seems like mankind is going to get the best out of it. And then ultimately, Christ completely defeats this thing. And that's sort of what this is hinting at, right? There's also other parallels, like of just mankind in general, going at war with the ungodly or other things that represent evil, or Satan, whether that's, Goliath or the Roman Empire at one point, or whatever other thing it is. So there's going to be this kind of constant theme. But what a lot of people agree that this is talking about is Christ. And that's how I see that. Woman receives the punishment of childbearing, which is a terrible thing. I mean, we kind of live in this comfort of this world, and it's still hard, right? Even with all the doctors and the medicines that we have, it's still a really tough thing. Much less, being back in that pre-modern society world, it just must have been a terrible thing. So I'm going to read 3:16 real quick, not John 3:16, but Genesis 3:16, because it's interesting. There's two different ways to look at this. The ESV has this differently than the New American, but to the woman he said, I will intensify the pangs of your childbearing. In pain shall you bring forth children, yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall be your master, where the ESV actually says your urge will be contrary. To me, it actually makes sense that when you look at the power dynamic of man and woman, she is kind of given no choice now, right? Because we before had God, and he was the person that was, the thing that was overseeing this, all of us, both me and women, and the animals and the plants and stuff. But now we're thrown out into this power structure world where, really whoever's in charge is the person that's the strongest willed type individual, or the person that has the most physical strength. And that's kind of the world that they're about to be thrown into. So in a way, it's almost saying like your desire is going to be for your husband, and that's not really going to be by choice. So you're going to have this kind of resistance that you're going to have to listen to him. And that's just sort of the reality of this situation. And she can't deny him. She can't deny Adam, or, women at any point in the ancient world couldn't deny men, because they would be thrown out and exposed to the cruelty of the world. And they sort of need mankind to just be able to be protected. So it's this interesting dynamic, and it's some interesting different ways that this passage is put. But I understand how it would be contrary, and I understand how there's also an urge for. It's sort of this yin and yang type of, just the nature of what happens. And so man is forced to toil the ground. Man is forced to work the ground all the days of its life. There's a comment about thorns and thistles, and this is very interesting that Christ, has a crown of thorns put on his head, which I think kind of symbolizes that he went through the punishment of man, even being sinless. He sort of took on these things. I mean, we have heel bone, we have thorns, and crucifixion wasn't even a thing at this time, right? So there's just so much speaking to me about Christ, and we're just getting into Genesis. But it is an interesting parallel that he sort of is getting thrown, or is getting this crown of thorns thrown onto him. And it's the same punishment that, is brought up to Adam. And they get as promised, they will be doomed to die. And that's at the end of this, for you are dirt, and dirt you shall return. Which, man, that just hits right in the gut. And they had this opportunity to live forever. And it didn't work out. And ultimately, I just think that was going to happen. And if, eventually, we don't really know how long that they kind of lived in this transit state, or whatever you would call it. But he treats them like he's still their father in many sense. I mean, in the sense of the world, he is their father, and he's making them leather garments. So the love is still there, and it's a bitter moment, but there's also something beautiful about it. Adam named his wife Eve, and he's still very proud of her. And she's the mother of all living. So they kind of, I think, see the error of their ways. And I think in my view of this, it's a way of God saying, you get to go live out on your own. You can't live forever like you used to. You're not going to have the tree of life. And that's what it'll talk about. But this kind of seems to, that whole previous world of being, living in this perfect comfort is kind of what people expect out of God. And that's why you get questions of why does God allow evil? And it's like, well, we had this opportunity, but we sort of, went a different way. And it's hard. Why would God trust us? I mean, he's God. He can do all things, and we are just men. We're just man and woman. Why would God trust us? And he gave it up. He did give us an opportunity to choose in the beginning, and we chose the wrong route. So we just have to live with this thing now. Man went east of the garden, and there's an angel that gets positioned to guard the garden. So, okay, that's chapter 3. We're moving on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is very eventful, and I think it's a really, really key moment in this whole situation. You have Cain that was born. He's the firstborn. The secondborn was Abel. Cain was a tiller of the soil. Abel was a keeper of the flocks. So for me, I think Abel might have been doing a little bit more work as far as physical labor, keeping up with animals. It's just probably a little bit more physically tolling. It's kind of like dealing with kids, right? It's just constant attention. It's just a different nature in which these things are happening. We don't really know as far as, did Abel work harder? Is this why God shows favor to Abel? And that is what happens. But we don't really know the specifics of that, but I could kind of see how Abel being in the mud and the dirt, with these animals, as opposed to Cain sort of kind of just watching these plants grow or watching grass grow. I could kind of see a difference there. So I'm sort of understanding where this difference comes from. But God takes favor in Abel's offering, and Cain reacts very poorly to this. So I'll just kind of read a little bit of it, but Cain greatly resented this and was crestfallen. And this is one of, for me, the most important passages of the Bible, and I feel like it's overlooked a lot. But it's chapter 4, it starts in verse 6, and it's this pep talk that God is trying to give Cain. It's the same pep talk I feel like he sort of tries to give all of us at some point. When we feel like we failed, or we feel like he's not proud of us or something. But so the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you so resentful and crestfallen? If you do well, you can hold up your head, and if not, but if not, sin is a demon lurking at the door. His urge is toward you, yet you can be his master." So, and that's said a little bit differently in the ESV. We're talking about sin instead of demons, but it's all the same story. It's all the same sort of message, or the same exact message, but it's a very overlooked verse, and it ends with, "You can roll over it. You can be its master." To me, and I kind of touched on this, and we're sort of led to believe that Satan is the one that's ruling this world right now. Even a lot of theologians, like a lot of Christians, say this. To me, I think we do have the power to roll over that, and it's very much instructed of us in this little pep talk in this 4:7. This Genesis chapter 4 verse 7 is very important, extremely overlooked in my opinion. But he is trying to get Cain to understand, you have to overcome this thing that you have, this sort of hate that is brewing within yourself. He knows what's going on. It's not just the sin of him being downtrodden. It's a deeper thing that's happening with Cain right now. He has this hate and resentment for his brother that is building up. And God is trying to get him to understand that he has to roll over it. It's such an important passage. And what happens is Cain, hears this message from God, and we get pep talks from people, but we don't get a direct pep talk from God. And one thing I want to point out is God hasn't left these people, right? In any capacity, he is with them still. He still loves his creation. And he's trying to get us to do the right thing. And this is just a continual thing in the Torah that we'll read about, and later in Kings and the rest of the book. But he's really trying right here with Cain. We get pep talks from other people, but Cain is literally getting a pep talk from God, and he still has this unbelief about himself. So it's hard, we have all these skeptics that live with us, and people, it's hard for them to see God, and I can understand that more. But even Cain can't see it. Being in the midst of God, he still can't see it. So it does speak to sort of the nature of how this happened. Cain goes the opposite way, guys. And Cain, he lets his hate and his anger take over him, and he kills his brother. And he doesn't just kill him in a fit of rage. It's very clear that he has him go out in the field. Let us go out in the field. And when they were in the field, Cain kills his brother Abel. And this is actually, for me, sort of where things really go sideways. I look at Eve and her sort of inability to stay away from this temptation of this thing, and I have a lot more sympathy actually for this. She's dealing with this ancient serpent that is the most cunning creature of all, and failed short, by eating an apple or whatever. And I think what Cain is doing here is just a different thing, guys. It's hate, and it's something that it gets into your heart. And what he does is, you can't ever take that back in killing somebody. So for me, it stands out as a different type of sin. It's still bad. Obviously, what Eve did, not great, obviously. But I view this as two different things. And that just might be my take on it. But here we really see why God... what was this whole thing about why does God allow evil? It really is a question of why does God allow us? That's the answer, truly. And that's what happens right here. So moving on, but yeah, this is a defining for who Cain is, and it's showing really deep down what it is. God knows about this, and he sort of, just calls on Cain, and out of almost like a courtesy, I guess, like, hey, what happened here? This is not good. And Cain's still just in this weird, this place of hate. Am I my brother's keeper? As you're probably familiar with that, but basically saying like, I'm not responsible for him. And he's his older brother, guys. It's just a sad thing. But the blood in this soil, there's something also, there's a parallel there with the soil that Cain was, supposed to be taking care of. And now this soil is just filled with blood of his brother. It's just a depressing sort of tragic situation. But he gets banned from this land, and he is meant to be a wanderer. And he can't even do the punishment that was given to man anymore. He was a tiller of the soil, and that was supposed to be the punishment to man. And he can't even do that now. God takes that away from him, and nothing's going to grow from whatever he puts forth. And Cain sort of has this complaining attitude about it, and is like, my punishment is too great to bear. And God shows mercy, and he is a merciful God. And so Cain basically is going to get gifted this thing that God does not have to gift him at all, which is protection. And anybody that kills Cain is going to be avenged sevenfold. And he's going to put a mark on Cain. Nobody knows what the mark is. We're not really meant to know what that is. But God is still protecting even this, murderous, hateful, unforgiving person. And it's actually a testament to how merciful and loving God is, even with things that he could have easily just killed Cain. Cain starts this new city. There are other people, obviously. There's kind of this old joke of with Adam and Eve and their kids, and how did the next generation get made. But it actually goes on to say that they do have other children, so we don't really know exactly when or where or how or whatever it was, but Cain finds another wife, or Cain finds a wife, and he basically has this whole city built, named after his first son, Enoch. We'll kind of go through the highlights of the people, but you sort of have Ada, who seems like the keeper of the cattle. This is kind of where agriculture is, I guess, first formed. You have Jubal, who plays the pipe, which is almost like a creation. Anytime it says father of, that usually means a creation. He was the ancestor of all who play the lyre and the pipe. And so you have music now in the society. You have Tubal Cain, which is seems to be like a blacksmith, or who forged, bronze and iron. So you sort of have this society that's popping up. And then we're introduced to this guy, Lamech. Lamech is something special. Lamech is just this new manifestation, like I mentioned earlier, of this evil thing. And he makes this proclamation that he's going to kill anybody that even touches him. I have killed a man for wounding me. A boy for bruising me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech is 77-fold. Christ will kind of talk about forgiving somebody from 7 times to 7. So he kind of goes the opposite. He takes what was said for bad and turns it into good. But Lamech is this evil guy that is taking it up a notch from Cain, is kind of how I see that. And now we're really into this world, right, that God's kind of trying to warn us about with the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And now he's like, this is it, guys. Like, this is the world that you're going to get thrown into. And we'll read about this world and how the Israelites deal with this world that's created. But God knows what they were doing at this time, all the evil things that they were doing. This guy killing boys for bruising him. We're sort of introduced to this new type of evil. It does end in chapter 4 on a high note, and it ends with Seth, who was born of Adam. Again, it talks about sort of replacing Abel as a as the next person in the line. But we have Seth now, and it also is a mention of the first prayer, is how I would read that. At that time, men began to invoke the Lord by name. So we're starting to get at least prayers now. So chapter 4, pretty dark, but we do kind of end on a high note with Seth and prayer. Chapter 5 is a very short chapter as far as content. I'm not the best about names and things, guys. I mean, we're not going to go through every name and make flashcards and memorize names. That's just not how I read the Bible. To be honest with you, I read it, but if I've I'm kind of skimming through a little bit when we get into these names. But it is important, and I want you guys to read it, and just it kind of gives you glimpses and talks about, number one, the people lived a long time. We get that in this passage. Adam lived to be a really long time. And it talks about, one day being 1,000 years for God, and what Peter said. And that's kind of how long that it takes for Adam to die. So what God said about him dying in one day or whatever, there could be a parallel there. There's another Lamech in this line of Seth. It's almost like a Stranger Things, like two different worlds, sort of. When you think about, there's like an Enoch and there's a Lamech. There's like two different societies that are being created. But in the end, like both societies kind of go the wrong way. They probably start kind of intermarrying with each other. But that is it, guys. That was chapters 1 through 5. I hope you enjoyed the podcast and the summarization of these things. I really, really enjoy our time together. And I love doing this with you guys. Next week is going to be Genesis chapters 6 through 11. We're going to talk about a lot of cool stuff, mostly the flood. We'll also open up with the Nephilim, which is a very interesting fallen angels sort of people that we'll talk about. We'll really dive into that. So definitely next week's going to be fun. But I love you guys. I'm glad you're doing this with me, and I will see you next week. Take care.